humble huts on 7 hills, gave birth to the greatest empire humanity has known. From obscure village to world conqueror, Rome forged its destiny through iron discipline, pragmatic governance, and ruthless adaptation. While Greeks debated philosophy, Romans built roads. Their legions marched from Britain to Syria. Their laws shaped 3 continents, and their monuments still stand millennia later. Through republic and empire, Rome survived civil wars, mad emperors, and barbarian invasions, transforming itself again and again until its final breath. Discover how a tiny settlement on the Tiber created a legacy so profound that even in collapse, it never truly fell. It merely changed its name. Before there was a city, there was a landscape. Central Italy lay as a long quilt of ridges and river valleys, stitched together by the slow course of the Tiber. Its waters cut through clay and tufa, bending toward the western sea, carrying silt that made the low plains of Latium fertile and treacherous in equal measure. Hills rose like islands above the marshes, the Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline, each offering dry ground, a defensive perch, and a view of the river's slow shimmer. In this narrow corridor between mountains and sea, the first Romans were not yet Romans. They were the descendants of scattered tribes whose huts smoked in the damp wind, and whose gods had no temples, only stones. Far earlier still, Indo-European migrants had filtered into the peninsula, bringing with them new speech and habits that reshaped the older Bronze Age world. Their words would harden into Latin, the language that turned command into poetry and law into stone. They came with horses, oxen, and the notion that land could be owned rather than shared. In the centuries that followed, that quiet idea would make and unmake empires. By around 900 BC, the long shadow of the Iron Age reached Latium. On the slopes north of the river, villages belonging to what we now call the Villanovan culture learned to smelt the darker metal that made sharper blades and stronger plowshares. Iron rewarded those who had access to ore and punished those who did not. Out of this new economy grew the first visible layers of inequality. Chieftains buried with their weapons, clans distinguished by the weight of bronze they could spare for a funeral. Society stiffened, hierarchy took root. Yet even as the earth changed, memory insisted that Rome was born not from ore or trade, but from destiny. The oldest stories began with a city already in ruins, Troy aflame at the end of the Bronze Age. From its smoke, the hero Aeneas was said to have fled, carrying his father on his back and his household gods in his arms. After long wandering, he landed on the Italian shore, where he made peace and children with the Latin king's daughter. Their son founded Lavinium, and their descendants ruled at Alba Longa, a ridge town south of the future Rome. Whether or not any of this happened mattered less than the conviction that it should have, that Roman blood was born of divine survival, half Trojan courage and half Italian soil. Generations later, the legend turned darker. From the line of Aeneas came the rightful king Numitor, overthrown by his brother Amulius. To end the old line, Amulius forced Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, into the priesthood of Vesta, binding her to chastity. But the god of war, Mars, had other designs. The priestess bore twin sons and hid them as long as she could. When soldiers cast the infants into the Tiber, the current carried them to safety at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, a she-wolf, or so the tale insists, nursed them until a shepherd found the boys and raised them as his own. The twins grew wild and strong, more at ease with spear and snare than with plough or pen. In time they discovered their birthright, slew the usurper, and restored their grandfather. Then they turned their gaze to the bend of the river, where they had been saved. Here they chose to build a new settlement, but could not agree upon its walls or its name. Romulus, the elder, marked his boundary with a plowshare. Remus, defiant, leapt across the furrow in jest. The blow that followed was the first Roman murder. The survivor, shaken but unrepentant, buried his brother and named the city after himself. Whether or not the twins ever lived, their story cast a long shadow. To later generations, the fratricide explained everything. Rome's genius for order and its curse of civil strife, its sacred discipline and its unending appetite for blood. Even in its infancy, the city was said to have been founded on the crime of kin against kin, a pattern it would replay for the next 1,000 years. While myth supplied meaning, the ground preserved evidence. On the Palatine Hill, traces of circular huts have been found, each built of wattle and daub, with a central hearth and a single doorway. Their floors are worn smooth by centuries of feet. Their ash still smells faintly of smoke when uncovered. These huts date to the mid-8th century BC, the very age that Roman historians later assigned to Romulus himself. From their arrangement, 7 or 8 dwellings clustered around a central court. We glimpse a society poised between tribe and city, already practicing shared rituals, already binding their fates to the hill's height. Around these early settlers gathered other Latin clans from the surrounding plain, joined by Sabine hill folk and, in time, touched by the rising power of the Etruscans to the north. Each brought its own gods and crafts. The Latins, their rustic lore, the Sabines, their austere piety, the Etruscans, their augurs, and their taste for ordered stone. From the fusion came a culture both pragmatic and superstitious, devoted equally to warfare and ceremony. A Roman offering was never made without precise gestures. A Roman oath, once sworn, bound the soul. These early peoples formed loose alliances for trade and worship. Chief among them was the Latin League, said to have met at the sacred grove of Alba Longa to honor Jupiter of the mountain. There, representatives of a dozen towns renewed their common vows, sacrificing a white bull whose blood sealed both peace and rivalry. Through such rites, Rome learned to speak the language of diplomacy long before it had legions to enforce it. By the middle of the 8th century BC, the new settlement on the Tiber was already fortifying itself. Earthen ramparts rose along the hill's edge, crowned with palisades. Within, small shrines marked the boundary between the living and the divine. The king's power was not yet a tyranny, but a ritual office. He led the people in war and in sacrifice, interpreting the will of the gods by the flight of birds. The priesthood, the hearth of Vesta, and the senate of elders, all these institutions, Romans later claimed, began under that first ruler. Whether memory or invention, they gave form to an idea that outlasted the huts themselves. The small community thrived on its position, a crossing of the river, a meeting point between land routes and sea lanes. Merchants from Etruria brought metalwork, traders from Campania brought wine and fine pottery. In return, the villagers sold salt from the marshes and cattle from the uplands. The settlement's rough paths hardened into streets, its timber posts into stone foundations. What began as a refuge became a marketplace, and what began as a myth became a polity. In time, the hill was no longer enough. The dwellers on the Palatine reached outward, toward the other mounds across the valley, binding them with bridges and shared walls. From their mingled villages, a single city took shape. Its first walls traced not ambition, but fear, of flood, of enemy, of divine displeasure. Yet those same walls marked a threshold between the wild and the governed, between pasture and forum. Within them, life acquired rhythm, festivals to mark the seasons, assemblies to judge disputes, sacrifices to ensure the favor of heaven. No one then could have imagined what the place would become, but even at the start, Rome bore the marks that would define it: a hunger for permanence, a readiness to absorb others, and a conviction that destiny was best built by hand. The huts on the Palatine have long since crumbled, yet the pattern they set, order wrested from chance, ritual masking violence, endured. From that mingling of legend and soil, the eternal city first drew breath. Every city begins as an argument about who gets to command it. Rome's first centuries were ruled by kings, men who wore the crown not as a symbol of glory, but as a tool for survival. Between the marsh and the mountain, the small settlement that Romulus had fenced with a plough now faced problems that only a ruler could solve: hunger, enemies, and the need for rules stronger than kinship. The crown in those days was not a bauble. It was a burden that had to be earned every morning. Legend says the founder ruled alone at first, his authority resting on charisma and a knack for violence. He summoned 100 elders to advise him. The Senate, born from the Latin word senex, old man. From their council came the idea that power should have witnesses. Romulus divided the people into clans and levied the first fighting force, the legions, whose oath was to the city rather than to any single chieftain. To fill its empty streets, he offered asylum to runaways and exiles. Rome was born cosmopolitan. Its walls were never meant to keep people out, but to keep them in once they had arrived. But no society grows without friction. Lacking wives for his new citizens, the founder staged a festival and invited the neighboring Sabines to attend. When the signal was given, the Romans seized the guests' daughters, an act later softened in memory as the abduction rather than the rape of the Sabine women. War followed. The Sabine king Tatius stormed the half-built city, and for a moment it seemed the new settlement would die as soon as it was born. Then, in the dust of battle, the abducted women themselves ran between the lines, begging fathers and husbands not to destroy the homes where their children had just been born. The fighting stopped. Two peoples became one. Two rulers shared a single throne, and the union of Latins and Sabines gave Rome a second birth, this time by persuasion rather than conquest. When the founder vanished in a storm, the Romans said he had been taken up to heaven and now watched over them as the god Quirinus. Whether deified or murdered by his counselors, he left behind a template: a king who commands soldiers, a senate that tempers his will, and a people who expect miracles of both. The next ruler, Numa Pompilius, was everything the first was not. Devout where his predecessor had been martial, patient where he had been fierce. Tradition called him a Sabine, and perhaps he was, for he taught the mixed people on the Tiber that the favor of the gods mattered as much as the skill of their arms. Under his rule, the city filled with rituals and calendars. He appointed the pontiffs to oversee sacrifice, the augurs to read the skies, and the Vestal virgins to guard the sacred flame. To the Romans, religion was not belief, but precision. Every gesture and word had to be exact, lest the gods feel slighted. Numa turned superstition into structure, and piety into law. After years of peace, the pendulum swung back toward violence. Tullus Hostilius, a descendant of the founder's line, scorned idleness and sought to prove Rome's strength against Alba Longa, the mother city of the Latin people. The contest was settled, legend says, not by armies, but by champions, 3 brothers against 3, fighting until one stood alone. Rome won, and the losing city was torn down, its inhabitants absorbed into the growing settlement. The conqueror's vigor restored Rome's pride, but his arrogance angered heaven. When lightning struck his house, killing him instantly, the Romans understood the warning. Ambition without reverence brings ruin. The next ruler, Ancus Marcius, learned the lesson well. Grandson of Numa, he balanced war and faith, piety and pragmatism. Under his rule, Rome looked outward again, building a bridge across the Tiber to secure its trade routes, and founding a port at Ostia where salt and ships met. The city's borders widened, its population swelled with new settlers from conquered lands. To govern them all, Ancus codified the rights of declaring war and concluded the first written treaties, a sign that law was beginning to rival the sword as Rome's preferred weapon. Even so, power attracts outsiders. Among the newcomers from Etruria came a man of cunning and ambition, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, later known as Tarquinius the Elder. His story begins with a change of fortune. Denied advancement in his own city because of his foreign birth, he came to Rome seeking opportunity. There, through wit and generosity, he won the people's trust and the throne itself. Under his hand, the city transformed. He drained marshes, laid out new forums, and began the construction of the Great Sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, whose tunnels still run beneath modern streets. More than an engineer, he was a visionary. He expanded the Senate, doubled the size of the legions, and adorned the city with symbols of kingship. Purple robes, ivory thrones, and triumphal processions that would one day define empire. But no vision lasts unchallenged. His successor, Servius Tullius, was said to have been born a slave, his head once crowned with mysterious flame as a child, an omen of greatness. Raised in the royal household, he proved a ruler of rare intelligence. Servius divided the citizens by wealth and census, giving every man a stake in the state's defense. Property determined one's rank in the army and one's voice in the assembly. For the first time, Rome's politics took numerical shape. The city was measured, classified, and disciplined into order. He encircled the 7 hills with a continuous wall, a declaration that the scattered villages had become one metropolis. Still, even a just ruler cannot escape envy. When Servius's daughter, Tullia, conspired with her husband Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, blood returned to the palace. The pair murdered the old king, and the new monarch seized the throne without the people's consent. Tarquinius the Proud, as he came to be called, ruled through fear. He silenced the Senate, executed rivals, and built monuments to his own name, most notably the Grand Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, a symbol meant to awe the gods and citizens alike. The price of tyranny came through one woman's suffering. Lucretia, a noble matron, was violated by the king's son. Her suicide, carried out in front of her kinsman, ignited the fury of Rome. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the people expelled the royal family, swore never again to tolerate a king, and founded a new order where 2 consuls would share power and serve for a single year. Thus, from outrage was born the Republic, a system that tried to balance ambition with accountability. When the smoke of revolution cleared, the city looked both forward and back. The 7 kings had given it more than walls and temples. They had taught it how to pray, how to fight, how to rule, and how to rebel. Each had added a layer: faith, war, law, expansion, construction, classification, revolt. The monarchy's fall was not an erasure, but a culmination. Rome had outgrown its kings, but it would never forget them. In every triumph, every legal code, every ceremony that bound state to deity, their shadows endured. The monarchy had been a rehearsal. What followed would test whether a city born from myth and tempered by rule could govern itself, not for a generation, but for centuries. The Republic had begun, and with it, the long experiment in power that would define the Western world. The last king had fallen, but his ghost lingered in every corner of the city he once ruled. Rome was free, yet freedom, as the citizens soon discovered, was as difficult to govern as tyranny. A monarchy could act swiftly. A republic had to argue its way forward. What began with the expulsion of a tyrant became an experiment in balancing ambition with restraint, a system built not on trust, but on suspicion. 2 consuls, elected yearly, replaced the crown. Each could veto the other's decisions, and both swore to defend the people and the state. Around them stood the Senate, that ancient council of elders, now transformed from royal advisors into the Republic's nervous conscience. Its members claimed to guard tradition against rash impulses, yet their own families clutched power like an inheritance. The patricians, a narrow band of noble houses, filled the magistracies and priesthoods, while the vast remainder, the plebeians, tilled the fields, fought in the legions, and found themselves shut out of the very government they defended. The monarchy's end had freed the city, but not its people. For a time, Rome's energies were turned outward. Nearby Etruscan towns tested the new republic, hoping that political chaos might make it easy prey. The exiled king Tarquinius the Proud fled north and found allies among the Etruscans of Clusium. Under their king, Lars Porsena, armies marched toward the Tiber, banners flashing bronze in the sunlight. At the bridge that guarded the city, one man stood his ground. The story tells that Horatius Cocles, alone against the enemy host, held the crossing until his comrades cut it down behind him, then swam the river in full armor to safety. Whether the tale grew in the telling or not, it gave the Republic its first hero, a symbol of personal sacrifice for communal survival. Victory, however, brought little harmony. As the wars dragged on, soldiers returned to find their farms neglected, their debts multiplied. The rich lent grain and coin at ruinous interest. When the poor could not pay, they were chained as bond servants. The city that had sworn itself to liberty now watched citizens sold like captives. Anger swelled until the commoners withdrew altogether, leaving their tools on the ground and camping apart from the city on the sacred mount. Without farmers or soldiers, Rome starved and trembled. The Senate capitulated. To protect the powerless, it created a new office, the tribune of the plebs, a magistrate whose body was declared inviolable and whose word could halt any decree. The plebeians returned, their hunger for justice temporarily satisfied. This uneasy compromise became the rhythm of the Republic. Crisis, reform, resentment, renewal. Every generation reopened the quarrel between high and low, each side calling its cause the true Rome. Laws emerged from stalemate, not divine revelation, but negotiation under pressure. Over time, these struggles produced the first recorded Roman legislation, the 12 Tables, a code carved on bronze tablets and set up in the Forum for all to see. The code did not promise equality, but it made oppression visible. A creditor might still seize his debtor, yet he could no longer do so in secret. A father retained authority over his household, but his rights now had limits written in metal and memory. Law became the Republic's new religion. Even as the city argued with itself, enemies surrounded it. The Volsci and Aequi raided from the hills, the Etruscans pressed from the north, and every summer seemed to bring another siege. Rome learned to live in a state of near-constant war. Out of necessity came discipline. The legions grew more organized, their ranks drilled into formation by commanders who had once been farmers themselves. The Republic's survival depended on the virtue it most admired: devotion to duty above personal gain. None embodied this ideal more perfectly than Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, a patrician who, legend says, was found ploughing his field when messengers came to beg his leadership against invading tribes. He accepted command, defeated the enemy in days, then relinquished power and returned to his plough. To later generations, he stood as proof that true authority lies in restraint, not possession. Still, the divide between rich and poor never healed. Each campaign that expanded Rome's lands widened its internal inequalities. Victories brought spoils to generals and senators, not to the rank and file. The plebeians demanded a share in the offices they funded with their blood. Step by step, through protest and persistence, they gained footholds: the right to intermarry with patricians, the ability to hold the consulship, the power to pass laws binding on all. What had begun as rebellion hardened into constitutional structure. The Republic's strength was its flexibility. Its weakness was the constant need to bend before breaking. Amid these domestic reforms, the Republic turned south and east, extending its reach across Latium. Some towns resisted, others allied, and through a web of treaties, Rome became the reluctant leader of a federation. Each victory brought new subjects and new anxieties. To manage its swelling territory, the city relied on a mixture of harsh discipline and calculated mercy: punish rebellion, reward loyalty, and allow the defeated just enough pride to serve willingly. The formula worked so well that within a century, Rome had become the dominant power of central Italy. Then, without warning, the rhythm of triumph stopped. From the north came a people no one had seen before. The Gauls, tall, fair-haired, their shields painted, their cries unearthly. Drawn by the rumor of plunder, they crossed the Apennines and fell upon the city of Clusium. The Romans, meddling in their quarrels, sent envoys who violated the laws of diplomacy by joining the local battle. The Gauls demanded justice. Rome refused. The invaders marched south, burning as they came. At the River Allia, not far from the capital, the Roman army broke. Panic spread faster than news. Within days, the enemy stood before the city gates. What followed was terror. The senators, too old to flee, sat in their ivory chairs, awaiting death. The younger men garrisoned the Capitoline Hill, while the rest fled into the countryside. The Gauls, led by Brennus, stormed through the streets, killing indiscriminately, then set the houses ablaze. Only the sacred geese of Juno, the story says, saved the citadel by their alarmed cries when raiders crept up the cliffs at night. For months, the defenders held out until famine forced them to bargain. The barbarians agreed to withdraw for a ransom in gold. When the weights used to measure the payment proved false, Brennus threw his sword onto the scales, declaring, "Woe to the conquered." In later centuries, Roman historians softened the humiliation. They claimed that Marcus Furius Camillus, recalled from exile, struck the Gauls as they counted the ransom and drove them off in sudden victory. Perhaps he did. Perhaps the city simply paid and rebuilt. Either way, the sack of 390 BC seared itself into Rome's memory. From that day forward, fear of northern invasion became a national obsession. The Republic resolved never again to leave its fate to chance or mercy. The reconstruction that followed was as much spiritual as physical. The walls were rebuilt in stone, broader and higher than before. new temples rose beside the ruins of old ones, and the rituals of purification multiplied. Outwardly, the city looked restored. Inwardly, it had hardened. Every institution, the Senate, the assemblies, the priesthoods, became more vigilant, more disciplined, more suspicious of individual ambition. Rome had survived not by divine favor, but by stubbornness, and that lesson became its creed. By the close of the 4th century, BC, the Republic was no longer a fragile experiment. It was a machine of endurance, capable of outlasting disaster by sheer will. Its citizens had learned to equate freedom with duty and defeat with delay. They had fought kings and neighbors, hunger and fire, yet still believed their destiny lay ahead. The Gauls had burned their homes, but they had also tempered their spirit. Out of ashes rose a conviction that would carry Rome from the banks of the Tiber to the edges of the known world, that no loss was final and no victory sufficient. The Republic had been baptized in flame, and the city that called itself eternal had begun to act as though it truly were. The smoke of the Gallic fires had barely cleared when the Romans began rebuilding not just their walls, but their confidence. The sack had burned away illusions. What remained was an iron will. From the ashes of humiliation rose a new kind of state, pragmatic, disciplined, and hungry. If the city had once survived by miracle, it would now survive by method. Reconstruction brought more than stone. It brought reform. The Senate commissioned a full reorganization of the army and the census. Service was now an obligation, measured by property, ensuring that every man had something to lose and something to defend. The legions were divided into flexible maniples, units that could fight across mountains and forests where phalanxes faltered. The new structure was not just a tactic, it was a philosophy. Rome had learned that rigidity breaks, but adaptation endures. From their rebuilt walls, the citizens looked outward. Their neighbors, Etruscans, Volsci, Aequi, and Hernici, had watched the city's near ruin and expected its end. Instead, they saw a force reborn. The Romans struck first, reclaiming the lost towns along the Tiber and pushing into Etruria. In the south, the Latins, once Rome's allies, grew restless. They no longer wished to share burdens without sharing command. The confrontation came in the Latin War of the 340s BC, a civil war in miniature between old partners who had outgrown each other. The Romans prevailed and dissolved the Latin League, absorbing its members through a policy both cunning and generous. Rather than destroy conquered communities, Rome offered them varying degrees of inclusion. Some towns became municipia, their inhabitants citizens with partial rights. Others received Latin rights, a kind of probationary citizenship that promised advancement through loyalty. These distinctions were complex, often unfair, but they worked. Rome turned former enemies into recruits, weaving a federation bound not by chains, but by contracts. It was a political revolution disguised as bureaucracy, conquest through paperwork. While the South submitted through negotiation, the heart of Italy still bristled with defiance. In the central mountains lived the Samnites, fierce hill tribes who prized independence above comfort. They were warriors of a different breed, agile, stubborn, and intimately familiar with the harsh terrain of Samnium. Conflict was inevitable. The Samnite Wars, fought over half a century, became the crucible in which Roman strategy matured. The first encounters humbled the legions. At the Caudine Forks, a narrow pass between cliffs, Roman troops were trapped without a fight and forced to surrender. They were made to pass under a yoke of spears. a ritual humiliation that scarred the national psyche. Yet from that shame came reform. The manipular system was refined. Soldiers learned to maneuver independently, adapting to ambush and hill warfare. When Rome returned to the mountains, it moved like water, bending but never breaking. Victory followed, but at a cost measured in generations. While the legions fought in the highlands, the Republic secured its flanks. To the north, Etruscan cities like Volsini and Tarquini were subdued one by one, their walls breached, their gods paraded in triumph through the streets of the capital. To the south, another power stirred, the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia, wealthy and refined, but riven by rivalry. The richest of them, Tarentum, viewed Roman expansion with alarm. When Roman ships entered its harbour in defiance of a treaty, the Greeks called for help from across the sea. Their saviour arrived not as a mere general, but as a king, Pyrrhus of Epirus, cousin of Alexander the Great and heir to his ambition. He landed in Italy with elephants, a novelty to Roman eyes, and an army trained in the old Macedonian style. At Heraclea and Asculum, he met the legions in battle. The cost was staggering. Though victorious, the Epirot saw his ranks thinned beyond repair. "Another such victory," he is said to have remarked, "and I am undone." Thus was born the phrase Pyrrhic victory, triumph too costly to sustain. Rome, battered but unyielding, refused to negotiate. Every loss became a lesson, every setback a spur. The Senate levied new armies, financed fresh campaigns, and learned to imitate the enemy's tactics while preserving its own discipline. Pyrrhus, weary and disillusioned, withdrew first to Sicily, then home to Greece, leaving behind the impression that Rome could not be defeated, only delayed. The withdrawal of the foreign king opened the path to dominance. City after city submitted, not always through conquest, but through the slow seduction of Roman order. Those who joined the Confederation gained protection, trade, and a share in the growing prestige of a power that seemed destined to rule. Those who resisted found their fields burned and their walls torn down. Then, more often than not, were offered a treaty anyway. The blend of ferocity and pragmatism was irresistible. By the early 3rd century BC, nearly all of the peninsula south of the Po River acknowledged Roman supremacy. Roads stitched the territories together, straight as ambition, and colonies anchored them like knots in a net. Each colony was a fragment of the capital transplanted. Grid streets, a forum, a temple, a miniature senate. Through them, Rome learned the art of empire before it ever ruled one. The conquests changed the city as much as the map. Veterans returned with foreign gods, new luxuries, and a growing sense that the world extended beyond the 7 hills. The influx of land and loot created both opportunity and tension. Patrician estates swelled, while smallholders found themselves pressed by debt or drawn away by constant service. Wealth began to tilt upward, and with it, the balance of the Republic. But for now, these strains were hidden beneath the triumphs. The Senate celebrated victory with religious solemnity. Processions wound through the streets. Generals rode in chariots crowned with laurel, and captured kings trudged behind them in chains. In the forums of conquered towns, bronze tablets recorded treaties and obligations, each one binding Italy tighter to the city on the Tiber. The Republic had mastered the art of making peace profitable, yet expansion carried its own momentum. Each success demanded the next. Trade routes pushed beyond Italy's shores, and with them came friction with new powers, especially across the narrow strait to Sicily, where Rome's interests brushed against those of Carthage. a wealthy maritime empire built on commerce and cunning. The peninsula, once Rome's cage, had become its springboard. When the dust of Italy's wars settled in 264 BC, the Republic stood transformed. In less than a century, it had turned from a regional survivor into the unchallenged master of the peninsula. Its armies had learned to fight any foe on any ground. Its diplomats had learned to govern without appearing to rule. The alliances it forged would feed its strength for generations, even as they sowed the seeds of future unrest. The conquest of Italy was not merely a military triumph. It was the invention of a system. Rome had discovered how to extend citizenship without losing control, how to conquer through inclusion as much as through fear. It had become more than a city. It was now an idea spreading by road and treaty, an organism whose growth seemed inevitable. The Republic's heart still beat on the banks of the Tiber, but its pulse now reached the mountains, coasts, and islands of a land that no longer thought of itself as many peoples, but as one. The age of Italy's wars had ended. Beyond the southern horizon, the sea waited, and across it, the first empire Rome would meet and measure itself against. The next enemy would not be a neighbor, but a mirror, another power built on ambition, wealth, and destiny. The Republic was ready. When the Romans first looked across the strait towards Sicily, they saw not the sea, but a question. How far could the Republic's reach extend before it ceased to be a city's rule and became an empire's? The island was a prize like no other, fertile, wealthy, and poised between worlds. Whoever held it controlled the trade that bound east and west. For centuries, that role belonged to Carthage, a maritime power whose merchants trafficked in silver, spices, and slaves. Its fleets crisscrossed the western Mediterranean, its harbors bristling with masts, its admirals with ambition. The Romans, still land soldiers at heart, had never mastered the sea. But in 264 BC, that was about to change. The spark was small, as great fires often are. A band of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines, former soldiers from Campania, seized the Sicilian city of Messana and appealed to both Rome and Carthage for aid when threatened by Syracuse, the island's Greek stronghold. Each power answered and found itself staring across the same harbor at the other. Neither intended a full-scale war. Neither could afford to back down. When Roman legions crossed into Sicily, Carthage declared that the mainlanders had violated its sphere. The First Punic War had begun. At sea, Carthage reigned supreme. Its crews were born sailors, trained from youth in oar and sail, while Rome had not a single warship to its name. Yet what the Republic lacked in experience, it compensated with obstinacy. Within months, Roman engineers studied wrecked Carthaginian vessels and built their own copies, turning shipyards into foundries of ambition. To offset their inexperience, they devised a brutal innovation. The corvus, a boarding bridge with an iron spike that could drop onto an enemy deck, locking the two ships together. The sea, Rome decided, would be made to behave like land. The first major clash came off Mylae in 260 BC. There, under Gaius Duilius, the new fleet met the Carthaginian squadrons head-on. At first, the enemy mocked the lumbering Roman ships, but once the corvus dropped, the laughter ended. Soldiers poured across the bridges as if storming a fortress, turning the naval fight into close-quarters carnage. Victory belonged to the amateurs. The consul returned home to unprecedented honors, including the right to be preceded through the streets by torchlight and flutes whenever he dined. A small empire of vanity carved from the Republic's gratitude. But the war was far from decided. The Carthaginians adapted, raiding Roman coasts and striking wherever their enemy was weakest. The Romans responded with relentless construction. Each lost fleet was rebuilt, each defeat treated as rehearsal. At Ecnomus, one of the largest naval battles of antiquity, over 1,000 ships clashed, their oars churning the sea into foam. Once again, Roman persistence triumphed. The Republic, intoxicated by its own momentum, decided to carry the war to Africa itself. In 256 BC, a vast armada ferried legions across the sea to strike at Carthage directly. At first, success seemed near. The general Regulus won early victories, and the Senate dreamed of dictating peace from the enemy's gates. Yet fortune turned swiftly. A Carthaginian counterattack, aided by Greek mercenaries under Xanthippus, crushed the invasion. Regulus was captured, his army annihilated, his men left to rot in captivity. Those who survived shipwrecks on the return journey told of storms so fierce that fleets vanished in a single night. Rome lost hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of lives, yet it did not surrender. For another decade, the struggle continued in weary rhythm. Sicily became a graveyard of ambition, its fields scarred by siege engines and unburied dead. Cities like Agrigentum and Lilybaeum changed hands more than once, their inhabitants paying taxes first to one master, then the other. Neither side could gain a decisive edge. Carthage had wealth and skill. Rome had manpower and will. Year after year, new citizens filled the legions and rowed the galleys. The Senate taxed itself to fund shipbuilding. Farmers saw their sons drafted again and again. The Republic's true strength lay not in genius, but in endurance. In the final phase of the war, command passed to a new generation. Among them was Gaius Lutatius Catulus, who in 241 BC led a reconstituted fleet to meet the Carthaginians near the Aegates Islands. Supplies were scarce, ships were lightened to make them faster, and the crews were a mix of veterans and hastily trained recruits. Against them sailed the remnants of the once great Carthaginian navy, burdened with provisions for a besieged army. When the winds turned, the lighter Roman ships drove into their lumbering foes with precision. The corvus had been abandoned, the crews no longer needed it. Skill had replaced improvisation. The victory was total. Carthage sued for peace, exhausted and bankrupt. The terms were harsh. It ceded Sicily, paid an enormous indemnity, and agreed to withdraw from Italian affairs. For the first time, Rome ruled territory beyond the peninsula. Sicily became the Republic's first overseas province, governed by a praetor sent from the capital. The shift seemed administrative, but it changed everything. The city that had once fought for survival now collected tribute from others. A door had opened onto empire, and behind it waited both wealth and corruption. At home, the spoils of victory shimmered through the streets. Grain from Sicily fed the populace. Captured slaves tilled the estates of the rich. Shipbuilders turned to merchants, senators to landlords. Trade expanded, and with it came new luxuries, glass, perfumes, imported fabrics, that began to erode the old austerity. Yet beneath the triumph lay disquiet. Naval warfare had demanded enormous resources, and the small farmers who had once formed the Republic's backbone found themselves impoverished by years of absence and taxation. Their fields, neglected or seized for debt, drifted into the hands of the wealthy. What had been a war for honor had quietly become a revolution in property. Still, to the citizens crowding the forum, none of this yet mattered. They saw only victory, the vanquished empire humbled, the legions returning in triumph. Processions carried spoils from Sicily, silver ingots, exotic animals, and the captured prows of enemy ships. Priests offered thanks to Neptune for teaching a land power the art of the sea. Rome had entered an age of confidence, convinced that no horizon was beyond reach. But the peace that followed was a peace of preparation. Carthage, though broken, still possessed its fleets, its commerce, and a will no less stubborn than Rome's. In the markets of Africa, merchants rebuilt their fortunes. In hidden shipyards, carpenters shaped new hulls. The Senate, meanwhile, turned its gaze elsewhere, to Sardinia, Corsica, and the distant shores of Spain. Both powers understood that their truce was temporary. The first contest had proved only who could survive longer. The second would decide who could not. The First Punic War had done more than shift borders. It had redrawn possibilities. The Republic had conquered the seas without ever ceasing to think like soldiers. It had turned setbacks into systems and desperation into doctrine. What began as a quarrel over mercenaries ended as the birth of a navy, a treasury, and an empire in training. The legions that once guarded a river now guarded a world. For now, the people celebrated. The Senate calculated, and the gods, as always, watched. Across the Mediterranean, in a city of harbours and incense, a young commander named Hamilcar Barca swore that his sons would never forgive the humiliation inflicted upon their homeland. Among them was a child named Hannibal. His time would come. The peace after the First Punic War had been uneasy, like a sword sheathed but never blunted. Rome had taken Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and now looked towards Spain, where silver, timber, and manpower promised new wealth. Across the sea, Carthage simmered. Beaten, fined, and stripped of empire, it turned west to rebuild. From its North African harbours, merchants sailed again, and from its council halls emerged a new dynasty of soldiers. The Barcids, a family forged in vengeance. At their head stood Hamilcar Barca, the veteran who had fought Rome to the last. He swore his sons to hatred of the Republic, and legend claimed that the eldest, Hannibal, placed his small hand on a sacrificial altar, vowing never to be a friend to Rome. When Hamilcar died in battle, his mantle passed to that child, now grown into a commander of rare brilliance and will. Under Hannibal's leadership, Carthage's holdings in Spain expanded swiftly. He captured the rich mines around New Carthage and founded settlements that filled the treasury his father had left empty. To the Romans, this growing power was a warning unheeded. When the city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome, was attacked by Hannibal's forces, the Senate demanded his surrender. Carthage refused. In 218 BC, war was declared, the second and greatest of the Punic Wars. The Republic expected another campaign in Spain or Africa. Instead, the Carthaginian commander chose the unthinkable. He would bring the fight to Italy itself. In the spring, Hannibal led an army north through Gaul, crossing rivers swollen with meltwater and tribes hostile to every step. At the Rhone, he outmaneuvered Roman scouts. At the Alps, he faced the mountains themselves. The crossing became legend, men freezing on the slopes, horses tumbling into ravines, elephants slipping on ice yet trudging onward through snow and rock. Of the tens of thousands who set out, perhaps half reached Italy alive. Yet their leader had achieved the impossible. When the news reached Rome, disbelief turned to panic. The Senate sent armies north, expecting to crush an exhausted enemy. Instead, they met a master of deception. At the Tiber River, Hannibal lured the legions into icy water, then struck from ambush. At Lake Trasimene, he hid his forces in morning fog and annihilated another army. the largest ambush the ancient world had seen. Each victory drew new Italian allies to his side, convinced that Rome's destiny had ended. The Republic teetered on collapse. Refugees flooded the capital, fields lay untended. Yet even in despair, the Senate refused negotiation. A new strategy emerged, one not of battle, but of survival. The consul Quintus Fabius Maximus, later called Cunctator, the delayer, shadowed Hannibal's movements without engaging him. He burned crops, blocked supplies, and avoided open combat. The tactic infuriated the public, who hungered for revenge, but it preserved the legions. The Senate learned the lesson the founder had once taught. Sometimes endurance is the truest courage. Then came Cannae. In 216 BC, the Romans assembled their largest army, yet nearly 80,000 men, and marched south to crush the invader. Hannibal arranged his troops in a crescent, placing his weaker forces at the center. As the legions pressed forward, the Carthaginian line bent, drawing them in. On the flanks, his cavalry wheeled and struck from behind. By nightfall, the Roman army had ceased to exist. As many as 50,000 lay dead. No defeat in the city's history was greater. The fields ran red for miles, and the Republic's allies began to waver. But Rome did not fall. Its people refused despair. Its Senate refused surrender. And its gods, or perhaps its will, refused silence. While the cities of southern Italy opened their gates to Hannibal, the core of the Republic held fast. New armies were raised from boys barely of age, and men past their prime. Women gave up jewelry to pay for arms. The state decreed public mourning, forbade lamentation, and ordered the citizens to continue as before. Even disaster was ritualized into discipline. Hannibal marched through Italy for more than a decade. He won battles at will, but could not force the city to yield. His allies faltered, his supplies dwindled. The Republic adopted a strategy of exhaustion: deny him reinforcements, harass his lines, reclaim lost ground town by town. Meanwhile, a new generation of commanders rose. Among them was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of a consul killed in Spain, a man whose ambition matched Hannibal's intellect. While Hannibal ravaged Italy, Scipio struck at his base. In Spain, he captured New Carthage, freeing hostages and seizing the mines that funded the enemy's war. He drilled his men relentlessly, blending Roman discipline with the fluid tactics he had learned from his adversary. By 205 BC, he persuaded the Senate to let him carry the war into Africa. The strategy once attempted by Regulus, now refined by experience. In 204 BC, Scipio landed near Utica, burning crops and drawing Carthaginian forces away from their heartland. The Council of Elders, desperate, recalled Hannibal from Italy. For the first time in years, the two greatest generals of their age faced each other. Near Zama, in 202 BC, they met in open battle. Hannibal's elephants charged first, but were turned by horns and shouts. His infantry fought stubbornly, but Scipio's cavalry, under Laelius and Massinissa, struck from behind. A reversal of Cannae's nightmare. The circle had closed. Carthage sued for peace. Its fleet was surrendered, its territories reduced, its indemnities doubled. Hannibal, spared but humiliated, withdrew into exile. Years later, hunted by his enemies, he ended his life with poison rather than be taken. The war that had begun with an oath ended with silence. Rome emerged triumphant but transformed. The Republic's victory had cost entire generations, and the Italian countryside lay scarred. Farms once worked by citizen soldiers were abandoned, bought by the wealthy, and turned into vast latifundia, estates tilled by slaves from the conquered lands. The free peasantry, foundation of the legions, began to erode. The Senate celebrated peace, but beneath the laurels grew a new tension. Wealth without balance, conquest without conscience. Yet in the moment of triumph, few saw the danger. The people rejoiced, the generals paraded their spoils, and temples rose in gratitude. Gold from Spain and Africa poured into the treasury. Marble and luxury replaced brick and thrift. The Republic, once a league of farmers, was now an empire in all but name. Its gods had not changed, but its heart had. In the quiet that followed, the Senate sent envoys to measure the world they had inherited. Carthage, crippled but alive, became a tributary. Spain was divided into provinces, governed by praetors and drained by taxes. The legions returned home veterans, hardened, disillusioned, and loyal more to their commanders than to the state. Among them, a whisper began to circulate. If Rome could defeat Hannibal, what could possibly defeat Rome? The answer, as always, would come from within. But for now, the Republic stood at its zenith, scarred, weary, and unassailable. The boy who had sworn hatred on an altar was dead. The city he despised had outlived him. And yet, in triumph, Rome had absorbed some of his fire. Hannibal had taught his enemies too well. Though Carthage had fallen, what it taught could not be forgotten. Rome had learned how to fight across seas, how to raise endless armies, and, most dangerously, how intoxicating victory could be. The Republic stood taller than ever before, its treasury swollen with Spanish silver, its legions seasoned and restless. Yet for all its vows of peace, the city had developed a new habit. Expansion had become a reflex. The Senate needed fresh enemies to justify its glory. Beyond Italy, the world waited. To the east lay Greece, not the ancient glory sung by poets, but a patchwork of kingdoms, leagues, and proud city-states living in the long shadow of Alexander the Great. The Macedonian kings still claimed to be heirs of his empire, and among them Philip V of Macedon sought to dominate the fractured Hellenic world. Rome entered this theatre not by design, but by invitation. Greek envoys, weary of Macedonian ambition, begged the Republic for help. The Senate, feigning reluctance, agreed. Its armies crossed the Adriatic, announcing themselves not as conquerors, but as liberators. At Cynocephalae, in 197 BC, Roman maniples met the Macedonian phalanx. The contrast was as old as tactics itself, flexibility against rigidity. When fog confused the field, the Macedonians could not adapt. The Roman formation pivoted, enveloped, and crushed them. Philip V sued for peace, leaving Rome the unchallenged arbiter of Greek affairs. The Republic declared Greece free, but its freedom came with supervision. Garrisons followed gifts, and the Greek cities soon discovered that Roman friendship was a polite form of custody. Victory drew the Republic deeper into the east. When Antiochus III, the so-called Great King of Syria, crossed into Greece, the Senate answered again. At Magnesia, Roman legions met the grand army of the Seleucid Empire and shattered it. The king's elephants fled, his phalanx dissolved, his empire shrank to the borders of his own capital. In less than a generation, the Republic had replaced Alexander's successors as master of the Mediterranean world. With triumph came transformation. The spoils of Asia were unlike anything Italy had known. Gold, ivory, incense, marble, manuscripts, the luxuries of centuries flooded the markets of Rome. Senators built villas patterned after Greek palaces. Their sons studied philosophy instead of farming. Their speech grew thick with borrowed words. Hellenic culture conquered its conquerors. Greek tutors filled patrician households. and statues of Apollo and Athena stood beside Jupiter and Mars. What had been rustic became refined, but refinement carried corruption in its wake. The influx of wealth also birthed new men, the publicani, tax contractors who bought the right to collect provincial revenue. They operated with ruthless efficiency, extorting tribute from communities nominally under Roman protection. The Senate turned a blind eye, content to share the profits. Empire had created a class richer than generals and less accountable than kings. Meanwhile, the victories abroad sharpened inequality at home. The great estates, the latifundia, spread across Italy, swallowing the small farms once tended by citizen soldiers. Slave labor from the east replaced free men in the fields. The countryside emptied while the cities swelled with the dispossessed. Rome's legions still marched, but their loyalty now came as much from pay as from patriotism. The Republic was learning to rule by debt and dependency. In the midst of this transformation, the old rival began to stir again. Carthage, though stripped of empire, had revived through commerce. Its merchants rebuilt fleets for trade, not war. Its harbors buzzed with life, its treasury filled once more. The city had become a model of recovery, and to some in the Senate, especially Cato the Elder, that was intolerable. Carthage must be destroyed. He ended every speech, no matter the topic. Fear, pride, and envy conspired into policy. The pretext came soon. A dispute flared between Carthage and Numidia, whose king, Massinissa, was Rome's favored ally. When Carthage defended itself without Roman approval, the Senate declared a breach of treaty. In 149 BC, legions landed on the African coast. The Third Punic War began, not from necessity, but from paranoia disguised as prudence. At first, the defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew there would be no mercy. Behind their walls, artisans forged weapons from temple bronze, and women cut their hair to make bowstrings. For 3 years, the siege dragged on. Disease and starvation hollowed the city, yet it would not yield. Command passed to Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of the conqueror of Hannibal. Methodically, he tightened the noose, building siege towers taller than the walls and cutting off the harbor with chains. In 146 BC, his troops stormed the breaches. Street by street, house by house, Carthage fell. When the fires subsided, the victors wept. Scipio himself, gazing on the ruins, is said to have whispered that the same fate would one day befall his own city. Whether he truly spoke the words, or later chroniclers imagined them, the warning rang true. The ashes of Carthage marked not only the end of an enemy, but the birth of empire's conscience. In the same year, the legions sacked Corinth, the proud jewel of Greece, for daring to defy their authority. Statues were melted down, citizens sold into slavery, and treasures shipped to Italy. Two worlds, Greece and Carthage, mind and commerce, had fallen together, leaving Rome unrivaled. Macedonia, Asia, and Africa became provinces, governed from afar by men who treated them as personal estates. The Republic stood at its zenith. From the Atlantic to the Aegean, its eagles cast shadows over 3 continents. The Senate commanded wealth beyond reckoning. Generals commanded loyalty beyond law. In the Forum, marble replaced brick. In the temples, Greek sculptors replaced native artisans. The city that had once measured greatness by virtue now measured it by territory. Still, beneath the triumphs ran cracks invisible to the jubilant. Veterans returned to find their farms absorbed by creditors. Citizens grew accustomed to handouts from provincial tribute. The very success that had lifted the Republic now began to hollow it. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, it had imported the seeds of its own undoing. The legions would continue to march, but their wars would no longer be fought for defense. They would fight for command, for profit, for men whose names would soon eclipse the Republic itself. For now, though, the senators feasted, the temples glittered, and the people cheered their invincibility. Beyond the harbours, the sea lay calm, reflecting the light of empire. It would not stay calm for long. After Carthage burned and Corinth fell, the legions returned home expecting peace. What they found instead was a republic swollen by victory and sickened by it. The wars that had made Rome rich had also unmade the balance that once kept it steady. In place of discipline came indulgence. In place of solidarity, suspicion. The world was conquered, and the conquerors had begun to consume themselves. Italy glittered with new fortunes. From the mines of Spain and the ports of Asia poured gold and goods enough to intoxicate a civilization. The old patrician houses built marble atriums where once there had been plaster, dined from silver platters and imported philosophers to soften their manners. But the gleam of empire had a shadow. Small farms, the lifeblood of the Republic, withered as veterans returned to find their plots lost to debt or absorbed into the vast latifundia. Estates worked by foreign slaves and overseen by absent masters. What had once been a nation of citizen farmers was dissolving into two classes, landlords and dependents. Dispossessed men drifted toward the capital. The streets of Rome grew crowded with the jobless, the hungry, and the bitter. Grain distributions became the only steady income. Votes became a commodity. The Senate saw the swelling crowds as a nuisance, not a warning. They mistook silence for loyalty and comfort for stability. Beneath the marble and the speeches, the city had begun to rot. From this decay rose two brothers whose names would divide an era, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Born to nobility, educated in the ideals of their ancestor Scipio Africanus, they believed that Rome's greatness depended on restoring the dignity of its people. Their mother, Cornelia, had raised them to measure glory, not by conquest, but by justice. When Tiberius became tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, he turned that conviction into law. His proposal was simple but revolutionary: enforce the old limits on public land and return the surplus to citizens who had none. The plan threatened the wealth of nearly every senator. Debate gave way to hysteria. When Tiberius brought his bill directly to the people, bypassing the Senate, his opponents branded him a tyrant. Violence followed. Amid the chaos of a public assembly, nobles and their clients armed themselves with broken benches and clubbed him to death. His body was thrown into the Tiber, and with it, the Republic's pretense of civility. Years later, Gaius Gracchus took up the cause his brother had died for. Fierce, eloquent, and far-sighted, he sought not only to restore land, but to reform the machinery of power itself. He established colonies for veterans, made grain affordable for the poor, and restructured juries to include the equestrian class, those wealthy men of business whom senators despised. He even proposed extending citizenship to the Italian allies who had long fought in Rome's wars without sharing its rights. For a moment, it seemed that change was possible. Hope did not last. The Senate, alarmed by his popularity, armed the state against its own reformer. Street battles broke out. The Aventine Hill ran with blood. Pursued by assassins, Gaius ordered his slave to kill him rather than be captured. His head was paraded through the streets, and his supporters executed by the hundreds. The Republic had learned that murder could silence reform more effectively than argument. Across the provinces, greed now replaced governance. The publicani, tax contractors empowered by Senate decrees, turned provincial administration into organized plunder. Governors competed to enrich themselves through extortion, bribery, and sale of justice. The law that once bound Rome together became a weapon of theft. Empire had turned into a marketplace for ambition. Meanwhile, the Italian allies grew restless. For generations, they had furnished troops for Rome's armies and paid taxes to her treasury, yet remained second-class subjects without citizenship. Their petitions met with indifference. When their pleas were ignored, resentment hardened into talk of rebellion. The Republic's strength, the loyalty of its allies, was decaying from neglect. At home, the Senate faced a different enemy, its own citizens. Rival factions armed gangs to dominate elections. Bribery replaced debate. Political meetings turned into riots, and victories at the polls depended more on intimidation than persuasion. The old rituals of the Republic continued, but they had become theatre. Slave uprisings in Sicily and southern Italy added another tremor. Tens of thousands of captives rose against their masters, promising freedom and vengeance. It took years and entire legions to crush them. The victories brought no relief, only fear of the next revolt. Power now belonged to those who commanded legions. Reformers without armies met the fate of the Gracchi. Generals with followers found that loyalty in uniform outweighed law in marble. The Republic's constitution still stood, but its soul had shifted from the Senate to the camps. In the countryside, olive groves and vineyards masked exhaustion. Towns emptied, roads filled with beggars, and rumors of conspiracy thickened. The Senate congratulated itself on stability, even as the foundations trembled. Italy was not yet in flames, but the air smelled of smoke. By century's end, the old order had become memory. The state that once prided itself on balance had turned brittle, each faction pulling against the other until the structure creaked. Beneath the statues of the Gracchi, crowds still gathered to mourn what might have been. Those monuments stood as quiet indictments, not of the brothers' ambition, but of a republic that could no longer reform itself without drawing blood. It began not with a foreign threat, but with a promise broken. Italy, newly bound under Roman citizenship after centuries of alliance, had expected equality. Instead, the Senate treated its new citizens as inferiors, their votes diluted, their voices drowned by manipulation. The Republic had expanded its borders, but not its heart. From this hypocrisy rose the most dangerous conflict of all, a war fought by brothers wearing the same armor. The social war was a mirror held to Rome's face. Allies who had marched beside the legions for generations now turned their spears toward the capital. The fighting tore across the peninsula. Hill towns burned, veterans slew former comrades, and the smoke of rebellion blackened the sky from Samnium to the Adriatic. Victory came only when the Senate conceded what it had long denied: full citizenship to those who would lay down arms. Italy became one nation at last, but at the cost of tens of thousands of dead and a republic that no longer trusted itself. While the ashes of that civil struggle still smoldered, new figures stepped forward, men whose ambition matched the size of the world Rome now ruled. Among them stood Gaius Marius, a soldier of rough manners and iron will. He was no patrician, born in Arpinum, hardened by campaign life. He had risen through sheer merit. His early triumph over Jugurtha of Numidia had made him a hero to the commoners and a menace to the aristocracy. Later, when Germanic tribes threatened the north, he saved the Republic again, commanding victory after victory, until his name carried the weight of a monarchy. Marius's greatest innovation was not a battle won, but an army remade. He abolished the property requirement for service, opening enlistment to landless men. The poor now fought for the state that had abandoned them, lured by pay, plunder, and the promise of land. Loyalty shifted from senate to general. Gratitude became currency. The Republic had created an army more professional and more dangerous than any before it. Watching all this with a calculating eye was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, once Marius's subordinate in Africa. He was everything his rival was not: aristocratic, eloquent, and ruthlessly self-controlled. Their hatred grew as swiftly as their fame. When the social war ended, a new conflict beckoned in the east. The campaign against Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus, a brilliant and volatile king who had massacred tens of thousands of Italians across Asia Minor. The Senate awarded the command to Sulla. The people, swayed by Marius, revoked it. That decision tore away the last pretense of legality. In 88 BC, Sulla marched his legions on Rome, the first Roman general to turn his sword inward. The city awoke to the tramp of boots and the glitter of drawn blades. Resistance collapsed before it began. Sulla declared his rival an outlaw and restored the Senate's supremacy. Power, for the first time, belonged to whoever could seize it. Exile could not contain Marius's fury. When Sulla departed east to fight Mithridates, the old general returned from Africa, gathered supporters, and captured the capital in turn. For days, Rome drowned in revenge. Nobles were hunted through the streets, their heads displayed on the rostra where speeches once rang. The blood that soaked the forum was not of foreigners, but of citizens. Marius, 70 years old and exhausted by hate, died soon after, leaving his followers to inherit the ruin he had made. Far away, Sulla campaigned through Greece and Asia, defeating Mithridates and looting his empire with clinical precision. His victories made him both rich and unstoppable. In 83 BC, he returned to Italy with 5 legions and a list of enemies. The Senate tried to placate him. His soldiers answered instead. Once more, civil war rolled across the peninsula. The final battle came outside the city walls. Sulla entered Rome not as liberator or conqueror, but as surgeon to a patient he claimed to cure by amputation. The dictatorship, an office untouched for centuries, was revived in his name. From that seat of absolute power, he remade the Republic in his image. Prescriptions followed, lists posted in the forum naming those marked for death. The killings were systematic, their logic bureaucratic. Properties of the condemned were auctioned, enriching allies and feeding the treasury. In the markets, men measured profit by how many corpses it took to earn it. Sulla called it purification. Others called it organized terror. For all the cruelty, he governed with cold efficiency. Laws were codified, magistrates restrained, and provincial administrations standardized. The Senate swelled to 600 members, its authority restored by fear rather than respect. He curtailed the powers of the tribunes, silencing the voice that had once belonged to the people, and rewrote the constitution so that no single man could ever again seize control as he had. The contradiction was exquisite. He destroyed liberty to preserve it. When his reforms were complete, he astonished everyone. He resigned. Without ceremony or successor, he retired to his villa on the Bay of Naples, dictating memoirs and boasting that he had saved the Republic. The peace that followed was as brittle as glass. No law could erase the memory of legions marching through their own city. Those who survived his purges learned the wrong lesson. They saw that the path to power no longer ran through debate, but through command. Among Sulla's protégés were two ambitious young men, Pompey, hailed already as the Great, and Crassus, whose fortune could buy whole provinces. Each would inherit his mentor's methods, though neither his restraint. The Republic was now a stage crowded with generals, and none intended to play a supporting role. In the countryside, confiscated lands were parceled to veterans who owed loyalty not to the state, but to the man who had given them farms. Armies became private estates. Citizens became clients in uniform. Even peace resembled war, quiet, watchful, and armed. When Sulla died in 78 BC, his funeral was a pageant of contradiction. The people mourning a tyrant who had restored order, the Senate praising a reformer who had undone the Republic. His body burned on a pyre built with confiscated timber, his ashes buried among heroes. Yet the flames that consumed him illuminated a truth no one could ignore. Rome could no longer be ruled by law alone. The age of generals had begun. The embers of Sulla's funeral had hardly cooled before new ambitions flickered to life. His dictatorship had shown that the Republic could survive a tyrant, and that tyranny could wear the mask of legality. The Senate, swollen by his reforms, sat fearful and inert, clinging to laws written by the man who had broken them. Italy, meanwhile, lay divided between veterans settled on stolen lands and dispossessed peasants who had nothing left to lose. Power, once shared through compromise, had become a contest fought with memory, gold, and the promise of soldiers' loyalty. Out of this uncertain peace emerged a restless generation. None believed in the Republic's purity, but all sought to inherit its prestige. The two brightest stars were opposites in every way. Pompey, the young general who had ridden Sulla's victories to early fame, and Crassus, whose fortune bought influence no sword could earn. Between them lay rivalry disguised as partnership, a balance of strength and wealth that would soon demand a third element, genius. That third element arrived quietly. Gaius Julius Caesar, a thin and debt-ridden noble, seemed at first a footnote among titans. His family, ancient but impoverished, had fallen from power during Sulla's proscriptions. While others courted stability, he gambled everything on charm and audacity. When Sulla ordered him to divorce his politically inconvenient wife, Caesar refused and fled. Only the dictator's death spared him. From exile, he learned a lesson that would shape his life. Authority, once challenged and survived, becomes habit. Returning to the capital, he entered a world addicted to spectacle. The Republic's politics had turned theatrical. Orators played to mobs, and triumphs had become pageants of vanity. Caesar mastered the stage instinctively. He dressed with precision, spoke with poise, and spent money he did not have to appear wealthier than anyone imagined. Creditors chased him, voters adored him. Every gesture built a myth of inevitability. Opportunity came through service abroad. In Spain, as a young governor, he settled debts by conquest, subduing rebellious tribes and enriching himself with plunder. His dispatches home displayed the same polished audacity that would later define his campaigns. Concise, theatrical, and impossible to ignore. When he returned to Rome, richer and seasoned, he found a city more unstable than ever. Gangs clashed in the streets, elections turned to riots, and the Senate's dignity had withered to a memory. Amid this chaos, Caesar recognized that politics alone could no longer move mountains. It required alliance. He approached Crassus, who controlled Rome's finances, and Pompey, who commanded its legions. Both distrusted one another. Both found in Caesar a useful mediator. In 60 BC, the three forged an understanding, later called the First Triumvirate, that united wealth, prestige, and cunning against the inertia of the Senate. Each wanted something the others could provide. Pompey, land for his soldiers; Crassus, relief for his creditors; Caesar, a command vast enough to match his ambition. Their pact worked. Caesar won the consulship and used it to push through legislation that satisfied both allies and infuriated traditionalists. Then, as his term ended, he secured a proconsular command in Gaul, a frontier rich in opportunity and glory. It was meant to remove him from Rome's stage. Instead, it gave him the world as an audience. Across the Alps, he began his transformation from politician to legend. The tribes of Gaul were fierce and fractious, their lands wide and untamed. Caesar subdued them one by one, adapting tactics as swiftly as he adapted languages. His campaigns were brutal but efficient, combining engineering, propaganda, and charisma in equal measure. When rebellion erupted, he crushed it. When submission was offered, he turned enemies into allies. The legions followed him with devotion bordering on worship. Their commander shared their hardships, addressed them as comrades, and made them rich. The reports he sent back to Rome, the commentaries on the Gallic War, were masterpieces of narrative control. Written in the third person, they made conquest sound like duty and ambition, like destiny. Senators read them with awe and dread. Every victory increased his fame. Every new territory brought him further from the laws that still pretended to govern him. Meanwhile, the alliance at home decayed. Crassus, seeking his own immortality, led an army east against the Parthians, only to perish at Cari, his body lost in desert sands. The balance among the triumvirs collapsed with him. Pompey, now sole consul, styled himself defender of the Republic, conveniently forgetting how often he had bent it. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's power, rallied around him as their champion. In Gaul, Caesar understood the game. His command was nearing its end. His enemies planned to prosecute him the moment he returned without his army. To disband his legions was to die. To keep them was to defy the state. The choice was no longer between peace and war, but between survival and surrender. The decision came on a cold night in 49 BC. At the banks of the Rubicon, the river marking the border of his province, Caesar hesitated only long enough to utter the line that history would never forget: Alea iacta est, the die is cast. Crossing with a single legion, he advanced south at a pace that made diplomacy meaningless. Panic swept the capital. Senators fled. Pompey evacuated the city, taking with him the treasury and the legitimacy of the old order. What followed was swift and bloodless at first. Caesar entered Rome not as conqueror, but as magistrate, promising clemency and order. He forbade looting, spared opponents, and declared that vengeance belonged to the gods, not to men. His restraint was as calculated as his courage. By sparing his enemies, he turned them into debtors of mercy. While Pompey gathered forces in Greece, Caesar secured Italy and Spain, taking surrender after surrender without breaking stride. Each victory tightened his hold on both the army and the narrative. He wrote letters instead of manifestos, pardoned enemies instead of executing them, and called his rebellion a restoration. The Senate called him an outlaw. The people called him hope. Across the Adriatic, the two giants prepared to meet. Pompey commanded the Republic's finest legions and fleets. Caesar, veterans forged in 10 years of conquest. Both claimed to defend the same state, yet only one could live within it. In the camps, soldiers prayed to the same gods for opposite outcomes, and couriers carried rumors that one battle would decide the future of liberty itself. Civil war was no longer tragedy, but tradition. Rome had learned to survive it the way it survived plague or flood, with endurance and forgetfulness. Yet this time felt different. Pompey fought to preserve the system that had raised him. Caesar fought to prove that the system no longer worked. Each man believed himself savior. Each feared becoming Sulla. As his legions marched east, Caesar paused to address them. His words were simple. They fought not against fellow Romans, but against corruption, not for conquest, but for justice. The speech was theatre, but it worked. The men who had followed him across mountains and seas followed him now against their own countrymen. On that march toward destiny, the Republic itself seemed to fade behind him like a receding shore. What waited ahead was not monarchy yet, but something that had never existed. A single man commanding a state that still pretended to be free. In that contradiction lay both Rome's genius and its doom. The Rubicon's ripples had become a tide. The next wave would carry Caesar across the sea to Pharsalus, to Egypt, to triumphs that would crown him as the greatest Roman of all, and to knives that would prove how fragile greatness could be. By the time Caesar reached the plains of Pharsalus in 48 BC, the Republic was already a memory dressed in armor. Across the dust and heat stood the army of Pompey, larger, better supplied, and carrying the Senate's last illusion of legitimacy. For months, the two men had stalked each other across Greece, trading letters filled with courtesy and venom. Pompey promised to defend liberty. Caesar promised to restore it. Both understood that only one would live to define the word. At dawn, the clash began. The senators who had fled Rome watched from the ridges, confident of victory. Pompey's cavalry swept forward, the decisive strike. But Caesar, anticipating it, had hidden a reserve of infantry behind his own lines. At the signal, they surged upward, driving their short swords into the exposed bellies of the riders' mounts. Chaos spread like fire in dry grass. When the dust cleared, Pompey's army had collapsed, and the defenders of the Republic were corpses scattered across the field. The victor's discipline, not his numbers, had won the day. Pompey fled across the Mediterranean to Egypt, seeking refuge with the boy king Ptolemy XIII. But dynasties play by colder rules than politics. When Caesar followed days later, he was met not by an army, but by a basket. Inside lay Pompey's severed head, offered as a gift. The gesture sickened him. He wept, historians say, not for the man, but for the meaning of the act. Rome's greatness, he understood, had been reduced to murder as diplomacy. His arrival in Egypt entangled him in another struggle, one of intrigue and beauty. Cleopatra, the exiled queen, smuggled herself into his quarters wrapped in a carpet, a performance worthy of any Roman stage. She spoke with wit and command, promising stability and wealth if restored to her throne. Caesar, ever drawn to charisma, obliged. Together they subdued her brother's forces at the Nile, and when the war ended, the queen sailed beside him up the river, her barge gilded and perfumed, a vision of the East's enchantment. From that union came a son, Caesarion, and a legend that would outlive them both. When the general returned to Rome, he found a city unsure how to receive him. Some hailed him as savior, others as monarch in waiting. The Senate, desperate to retain dignity, greeted him with 1,000 honors. Dictator for a year became dictator for 10. 10 became for life. Each title was justified as necessity, to stabilize, to rebuild, to govern. The Republic's legal forms remained, but their meaning drained away like water through sand. His rule, though absolute, was not careless. Caesar governed with the energy of a man who believed his genius might outrun mortality. He restructured debt, reformed the calendar, aligning it with the sun rather than superstition, and sent colonies of veterans to distant provinces to ease the city's hunger. Citizens received land, laws, and bread. Senators received titles and flattery. His justice was swift, sometimes merciful, sometimes theatrical. Clemency became his trademark. Forgiveness, his most effective weapon. The men who had fought against him found themselves seated beside him, indebted to the magnanimity they secretly feared. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The optimates, those who still clung to the memory of an aristocratic republic, whispered that one man now held the power of kings. Statues of his likeness filled the forums. His face appeared on coins, a privilege once reserved for gods. When a crowd placed a laurel wreath on his statue's head, rumors spread that he had accepted it as a crown. Caesar laughed it off, but laughter could not silence the old Roman instinct that no man, however great, should be called Rex. The discontent reached its climax during the Lupercalia festival. Before the assembled people, Mark Antony, his loyal lieutenant, offered him a diadem. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time Caesar refused, to the roaring approval of the crowd. The gesture was theatre, yet even theatre can reveal what words conceal. Those who saw the exchange understood that refusal itself was proof of power. Only a man already greater than king could afford to decline the title. In the Senate, the conspiracy coalesced. Its members were not madmen or malcontents, but men who feared extinction of their class. Among them were Cassius, bitter and sharp, and Marcus Junius Brutus, the very emblem of republican virtue and Caesar's former ally. The dictator trusted him, perhaps even loved him, seeing in him a reflection of the old ideals he claimed to preserve. Trust, in politics, is merely delay before betrayal. On the morning of the Ides of March, 44 BC, omens abounded. Thunder, strange lights, dreams of blood. His wife, Calpurnia, begged him to stay home. He almost agreed, until a senator came urging that the Senate intended to crown him that day. Pride triumphed over caution. Draped in his crimson robe, Caesar walked through the forum toward the Curia of Pompey, the theatre where his rival's statue still stood. Fate has a taste for symmetry. Inside, the senators rose to greet him. Then they closed in. Steel flashed. The first knife glanced off his shoulder. The second struck deep. He fought at first, then saw among the faces his friend, Brutus. "You too, my son?" he said, or perhaps only thought it. The words were enough. Resistance left him. He pulled his toga over his head and fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling around the marble feet of the man whose ghost had never left him. The conspirators rushed into the forum shouting, "Liberty!" But the people, stunned and leaderless, gave no cheer. They had grown accustomed to the order his rule provided. What came next was confusion. Mourning mingled with awe, grief with calculation. The Republic had regained its freedom, yet none knew what to do with it. At the funeral, Antony read aloud Caesar's will, revealing gifts to every citizen and naming his grandnephew Octavian as heir. The crowd's sorrow turned to fury. They stormed the conspirators' homes, burned them in effigy, and filled the air with cries not for liberty, but for vengeance. Rome, once more, had traded tyranny for anarchy. The men who had killed a dictator to save the Republic had instead buried it with him. His body lay upon a pyre in the forum, his life consumed by the same flames that once devoured Sulla's. Yet unlike that earlier fire, this one did not fade. It lit the path for new powers, for Antony, for Octavian, for a world where Caesar's name would become a title, and the word emperor would replace citizen. For now, the smoke curled upward, black and unending. The man who had crossed rivers, mountains, and nations had crossed at last into legend. The Republic, bleeding and bewildered, stood at the edge of an age it no longer understood. The smoke from Caesar's funeral pyre drifted for days over the forum, mingling with the prayers, curses, and gossip of a city that could no longer tell grief from fear. His death had not restored liberty. It had shattered the last illusion that liberty still existed. The conspirators who called themselves liberators expected gratitude. Instead, they found themselves isolated in a city that mourned the man they had slain. Rome had killed its master, only to discover that it no longer knew how to govern itself. In the uneasy silence that followed, two men stepped forward to claim his legacy. Mark Antony, the loyal lieutenant and consummate soldier, held the loyalty of the legions and the ear of the crowd. Gaius Octavius, barely 19 and newly arrived from Apollonia, carried something even more potent: adoption. In Caesar's will, he had been named heir and posthumous son, a legal fiction with revolutionary force. The youth took his inheritance seriously. He called himself Caesar Octavianus, and from that moment, his life's purpose became clear: to avenge and succeed the man who had made him immortal. At first, few took him seriously. Antony mocked him as a boy playing politics. The Senate tried to use him as a counterweight, flattering him with promises and dismissing him in whispers. But Octavian's patience was steel wrapped in silk. He courted veterans with quiet generosity, promised the people stability, and built an army, loyal not to Rome, but to his name. Within months, he commanded 10 legions, an army conjured from Caesar's memory. Antony, meanwhile, controlled the capital. His funeral oration for Caesar had set the streets ablaze with fury, transforming public sorrow into vengeance. The crowd, roused by his words and the sight of the blood-stained toga, turned on the assassins. The liberators fled east, first to Macedonia, then to the provinces where old allies still held sway. In their wake, Antony assumed power as though destiny had anointed him. What followed was chaos without coordination. The Senate, desperate to restore order, sent forces against Antony under the command of the cautious Cicero, who hailed Octavian as the Republic's savior. For a moment, it seemed the old system might reassert itself, but victories in the field shifted the balance again. Octavian, armed with legitimacy and ambition, marched his troops toward Rome and demanded the consulship. The Senate refused. The soldiers did not. The boy who had once been dismissed as a pawn entered the city as its master. From that point, compromise was inevitable. Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus, the governor of Spain, met on a riverbank near Bononia to divide the Republic's corpse. Their alliance, known as the Second Triumvirate, was legalized by terror and bound by necessity. Each man would rule a portion of the empire: Antony the east, Octavian the west, Lepidus Africa. Together they swore vengeance on the men who had struck down Caesar. The proscriptions began almost immediately. Lists were posted in the forum, names of those condemned for treason, extortion, or simply convenience. Wealthy citizens were hunted, their properties seized to pay the armies that pursued them. Cicero, who had once defended the Republic with words, fell by the sword. His head and hands were nailed to the rostra where his orations had rung. Rome had not been this silent since Sulla's purges, and once again, silence meant safety. Across the sea, the liberators gathered their forces, Brutus and Cassius commanding the armies of the east, proclaimed themselves restorers of freedom. In 42 BC, the opposing sides met in the plains near Philippi. The battle lasted 2 days and ended with the Republic's last breath. Cassius died by his own hand. Brutus followed soon after. Antony honored his fallen enemy with burial rites, but the gesture could not mask the truth. The cause of liberty was dead, its defenders' ashes scattered on Macedonian soil. After Philippi, the victors turned upon one another. Lepidus, the weakest of the trio, was sidelined, leaving the world to be divided between Antony and Octavian. For a time, the arrangement worked. Antony took the east, vast, wealthy, and intoxicating. There in Alexandria, he met Cleopatra, the queen who had once captivated Caesar. Their alliance began as strategy and ended as legend. She saw in him a new Caesar. He saw in her the glamour and grandeur of empire itself. While Antony reveled in the luxuries of Egypt, Octavian played the Roman patriot to perfection. In Rome, he cultivated austerity, portraying himself as defender of Italian virtue against the corruption of the East. His propaganda was subtle and relentless. Coins depicted him as Caesar's rightful heir. Poets praised his chastity and discipline. The Senate, exhausted by decades of violence, turned toward the young man who promised peace through order. The conflict that followed was fought as much with symbols as with swords. Antony's union with Cleopatra was denounced as treasonous decadence, the seduction of a Roman by an Eastern queen. Rumors spread that he meant to move the capital to Alexandria, to crown Cleopatra Queen of Kings, and to make their children heirs to Rome. Whether true or not, the narrative worked. The Republic rallied behind Octavian, not for what he was, but for what Antony seemed to have betrayed. In 32 BC, the alliance collapsed completely. The Senate declared war not on Antony, whom many still loved, but on Cleopatra, a convenient fiction that made civil war sound like defense of country. Octavian's Admiral Agrippa commanded the fleet that met their combined forces off the coast of Actium in 31 BC. The battle began as a contest of maneuver and ended as a rout. Surrounded and outnumbered, Cleopatra's ships turned to flee. Antony followed her, abandoning his fleet. The sea burned with oil and corpses as the future of Rome tilted westward. In the months that followed, the lovers retreated to Egypt, pursued by Octavian's legions. Trapped in the palace of Alexandria, they chose legend over capture. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, in the silence that followed, took her life by the bite of an asp, the serpent of her own goddess. Their deaths closed not only an age of romance, but an age of civil war. The Republic, long dead, finally stopped pretending to breathe. When Octavian entered the city, he found it weary rather than jubilant. The people no longer cared who ruled, only that the killing had ended. Senators greeted him with rehearsed adoration, the same gesture they had once offered his adoptive father. He accepted every honor and refused every crown, at least for now. Behind the modesty was calculation. Rome was not ready for a king, but it was ready for something new. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, Octavian stood alone at the center of the world. The wars were over, but peace itself required reinvention. The Republic had perished not in battle, but in the slow corrosion of faith. Out of its ruins, a new order would rise, not a monarchy declared, but an empire disguised as restoration. When Octavian returned from Egypt, the world was quiet for the first time in a century. Behind him lay the ruins of republics, kingdoms, and lovers. Before him stretched an empire waiting for a name. The Senate hailed him as savior, the people as peacemaker, and even his enemies admitted that fatigue was now his strongest ally. No one wanted freedom if it meant another war. The young man who had begun as Caesar's heir would end as something Rome had never known. A ruler whose power seemed natural, inevitable, and permanent. His triumph in 29 BC was less celebration than coronation. Chariots rolled through the streets laden with spoils from Greece, Asia, and Egypt. Statues of conquered kings followed behind like a parade of ghosts. Octavian walked last, robed in white, a figure of restraint amid excess. He did not call himself king, the word was still poison, but the theatre of monarchy was already his. In the years that followed, he moved carefully, reshaping the state without breaking its shell. In 27 BC, he staged his masterstroke. Before the Senate, he renounced all extraordinary powers, declaring the Republic restored. The gesture brought him every power he had just surrendered. Senators begged him to remain as princeps, the first citizen. From that fiction arose a new reality. Octavian became Augustus, a name meaning sacred and majestic, as if the gods themselves had sanctioned his rule. His genius lay in balance. He clothed autocracy in the language of tradition, dictatorship in the dress of duty. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, but everyone knew who decided the outcome. He divided the empire into provinces, some senatorial, governed by old aristocrats, others imperial, controlled directly through his legates and armies. The illusion of the Republic endured because it was convenient to believe it. Peace required more than politics. After decades of bloodshed, Augustus understood that stability must be built into the bones of daily life. He reformed taxation, created a standing army with fixed terms of service, and established the Praetorian Guard, 9,000 soldiers sworn to protect his person, and in time to decide the fate of his successors. Roads extended like veins across the provinces, carrying goods, ideas, and soldiers. A census counted every citizen and slave. Nothing escaped the state's gaze. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, began not as a miracle, but as administration. Grain from Egypt fed the capital. Aqueducts carried water into its crowded hills. New laws rewarded marriage and penalized adultery, seeking to revive the virtue the old republic had lost. The city itself transformed. On ground, once scorched by civil war, rose monuments of marble and order. The Arapaces, the altar of peace, with its friezes of abundance and family. The Forum of Augustus, lined with statues of ancestors who seemed to nod in approval. I found Rome a city of brick, he later said, and left it a city of marble. It was not boast, but blueprint. Culture flowered in the long calm. Poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid turned history into myth and myth into praise. In the Aeneid, Virgil gave Rome its sacred story. Aeneas, fleeing Troy, founding a race destined to rule by mercy as much as might. The poem was both prophecy and propaganda, binding the empire's vastness to a single destiny. Scholars compiled chronicles, sculptors idealized the imperial family, and even religion bent to the new order. Temples to Augustus's genius rose beside those of Jupiter. The line between mortal and divine blurred into ceremony. Beyond the walls, legions still fought, but now in service of stability, not survival. Campaigns in Spain and the Alps closed the last gaps of resistance within the European heartland. To the north, in Germania, ambitious generals pushed beyond the Rhine, dreaming of another province. At first they succeeded, but in AD 9 came disaster. In the dense Teutoburg forest, 3 Roman legions under Varus were ambushed and annihilated by tribes led by Arminius, a former ally. The news reached Rome like a thunderclap. Augustus, now an old man, struck his head against the wall and cried, "Varus, give me back my legions." It was grief not for numbers, but for illusion. The realization that even empire had limits. Inside those limits, prosperity flourished. The provinces, long treated as conquered lands, became partners in an imperial economy. Veterans settled in colonies from Gaul to Syria. Merchants shipped wine, glass, and olive oil across the Mediterranean. Latin replaced local tongues. Roman law replaced tribal custom. Roads carried more than armies, they carried identity. The empire no longer belonged solely to the city on the Tiber. It belonged to the system Augustus had built. Yet even peace cast shadows. The moral laws he imposed felt like theatre to a generation raised on power and pleasure. His only child, Julia, was exiled for scandal, proof that virtue decreed from above could not control desire below. The Senate, obedient and ornamental, forgot how to oppose. Power passed smoothly because no one dared remember a time before it. As age crept upon him, Augustus turned to the question that haunts all monarchs who pretend not to be. He had no surviving sons, only stepsons through Livia, his formidable wife. One by one, they died or fell from favor, until only Tiberius, dour and reluctant, remained. In AD 14, the first emperor of Rome died quietly at Nola, the same town where his father had once died in obscurity. The city he left behind mourned him as a god and buried him in a marble mausoleum by the river. His reign had lasted 45 years, long enough for a generation to grow up knowing no other order. The Republic had vanished without funeral or epitaph, replaced by a new vocabulary: emperor instead of consul, subjects instead of citizens, dynasty instead of debate. Yet Augustus had achieved what no ruler before him dared attempt, a peace that outlived him. The marble shone white under the Mediterranean sun, but beneath its surface ran veins of tension that would one day crack it. Still, for a brief, golden span, Rome believed the future had been mastered, and the man who had tamed it could be immortal. The age of Augustus had begun the story of empire, and ended the story of the Republic forever. The death of Augustus left Rome suspended between worship and uncertainty. No one alive could remember a time without him, and yet the empire he had built could not die with its founder. Power passed to Tiberius, his reluctant stepson, who inherited a throne disguised as a republic and an empire that still pretended to be free. He was a capable soldier and a cautious ruler, but the shadow of his predecessor followed him everywhere. The Senate called him princeps. The people called him a miser. He governed by restraint, reducing taxes, consolidating borders, and quietly distrusting everyone. In his later years, suspicion consumed him. He withdrew from Rome to the island of Capri, leaving the city in the hands of ambitious ministers who ruled through fear. Executions became ceremonies. Informers thrived. The peace of Augustus hardened into paralysis. When Tiberius finally died in AD 37, smothered perhaps by his own guards, relief swept the capital like a festival. Rome had learned the rhythm of emperors: obedience, terror, and then release. That release came in the form of Caligula, the young great-grandson of Augustus and the darling of the legions. At first, his charm revived the city: amnesties, games, generous gifts. But absolute power in an untested mind breeds delirium. Caligula's rule descended into spectacle. He built bridges across harbors to mimic Alexander, demanded worship as a living god, and conversed with statues. When senators hesitated to adore him, he threatened to make his horse a consul, not out of humor, but contempt. In the 4th year of his reign, his own guards turned their swords against him, proving that even divinity could bleed. After the chaos came competence. Claudius, uncle to Caligula and once dismissed as a stammering scholar, surprised everyone by surviving. Behind the awkward gestures and cautious tone lay an efficient mind. He reorganized the administration, expanded citizenship, and brought new provinces into the empire, including Britain, whose conquest fulfilled the boast of generations. He strengthened the bureaucracy that would outlast dynasties, replacing noble birth with talent. Yet his private life was less orderly. His marriages became scandal. His final wife, Agrippina, ensured her son Nero would inherit both throne and curse. Nero's early reign began with promise. Guided by wise tutors like Seneca, he patronized the arts and entertained visions of a cultured empire. But vanity proved stronger than virtue. The young emperor sought applause rather than approval, performing music on public stages while senators applauded from terror. In AD 64, a great fire devoured half the city. Rumor blamed Nero. He blamed the Christians, a small sect too weak to defend itself. Persecutions followed, savage and theatrical. His extravagance bankrupted the treasury. His paranoia emptied the Senate. At last, condemned by his own guards, he fled into the suburbs and ended his life with the words, "What an artist dies in me." With him, the Julio-Claudian dynasty died as well. The empire reeled. In a single year, AD 69, 4 claimants wore the purple in quick succession. Legions declared their own generals emperor. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, each rising and falling faster than decrees could be carved. When the dust settled, one commander remained. Vespasian, a soldier of modest birth and solid discipline. His victory ended chaos and founded the Flavian dynasty, a return to pragmatism after decades of theatre. Under Vespasian and his sons, Rome regained its footing. The Colosseum rose from the drained lake of Nero's pleasure palace, a monument to order over indulgence. His son Titus, beloved for his generosity, completed the building and faced disaster with composure. A volcanic eruption in Pompeii, a fire and a plague, all within his brief reign. "I have only made one mistake," he said on his deathbed, "when I failed to do a man kindness." His brother Domitian, who followed, lacked such grace. Efficient but paranoid, he ruled by fear until assassins freed the empire of his efficiency. After Domitian's death in AD 96, the Senate, weary of dynasties, turned to adoption as salvation. What followed was the most stable century Rome would ever know, the era of the 5 good emperors. The first, Nerva, restored legality and respect. He adopted as heir Trajan, a soldier from Spain, marking the first time the imperial throne passed beyond Italy. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest reach, Dacia, Arabia, and even the fringes of Mesopotamia. Wealth from the Dacian mines filled Rome's coffers. His column still spirals upward in the Forum, carved with scenes of conquest that read like scripture. Yet Trajan's glory was measured not only in territory, but in roads, aqueducts, and justice. The empire under him felt both vast and coherent, its edges connected by stone and law. His chosen successor, Hadrian, redefined rule as preservation rather than conquest. Traveling more than any emperor before him, he inspected every frontier, building walls where expansion had become folly. In distant Britain, he marked the empire's northern limit with a barrier of stone and vigilance, Hadrian's Wall, not to isolate Rome from the world, but to remind it of proportion. He loved art, architecture, and ideas, raising the Pantheon anew with its perfect dome. a geometry of faith in human order. Yet behind his calm intellect lay melancholy. The death of his companion Antinous in the Nile broke him. He raised temples and statues to the boy, fusing grief with deification. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, whose reign of quiet prosperity was so uneventful that later generations mistook it for decline. Under his governance, taxes were light, borders secure, and justice impartial. Rome no longer needed conquest to feel eternal. His adopted son, Marcus Aurelius, inherited peace, but also the storms gathering beyond it. Marcus ruled as philosopher as much as emperor. Between campaigns along the Danube, he wrote meditations on duty and endurance, words that survived even when his victories did not. His reign tested the resilience of the Pax Romana. Plague swept through the empire, possibly smallpox, killing 1 in 10. To the north, Germanic tribes pressed harder each year, drawn by famine and Rome's wealth. The emperor fought them not for glory, but for survival, scribbling thoughts on fate by lamplight in winter camps. Beside him served his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, who died before the war's end, and later his own son, Commodus, whose vanity made the philosopher despair. When Marcus died in 180 AD, the golden chain of adoption broke. His successors would inherit an empire still glittering, but cracking beneath its own weight. For nearly 2 centuries, Rome had been governed by competence, an accident of wisdom sustained by fear of failure. Its frontiers stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Its cities thrived, its laws outlived their makers. Yet prosperity breeds amnesia. The citizens who once trembled at civil war now took peace for granted. The age of the good emperors closed not with a fall, but with a sigh. The calm before an empire remembered how mortal it was. When Marcus Aurelius died in AD 180, the empire mourned a philosopher and gained a problem. For nearly 100 years, power had passed peacefully through adoption, intellect, and merit. Now, for the first time in generations, the throne went by blood. His son, Commodus, inherited an empire at its height and began to hollow it from within. At first, the young ruler styled himself a new Hercules, appearing in the arena to fight wild beasts and gladiators for applause. The Senate watched in disbelief as their emperor turned the symbol of sovereignty into theatre. He renamed months after himself, the city after his divine titles, and executed those who refused to flatter him. The philosopher's son had become a parody of monarchy. When assassins finally strangled him in his bath in AD 192, the relief was almost gratitude, but murder had become policy. The death of Commodus unleashed chaos that echoed the fall of the Republic. In a single year, 5 claimants rose and fell, generals proclaimed by their legions, bidding for empire with blood and coin. Out of the slaughter emerged Septimius Severus, a soldier from Africa, shrewd and relentless. He restored order through the army, declaring that soldiers, not senators, were the backbone of the state. Under his reign, the empire felt both secure and brittle, its peace purchased by pay raises and promises. Enrich the soldiers, he told his sons, and despise all others. It was prophecy disguised as advice. After Severus's death, his heirs, Caracalla and Geta, proved the warning true. They quarreled until Caracalla murdered his brother in their mother's arms. To secure loyalty, he extended Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire. Not from generosity, but to broaden the tax base. The gesture transformed identity, but not loyalty. The empire had become too vast to be united by law alone. The 3rd century opened like a wound. Civil wars erupted faster than they could be ended. Emperors rose from frontier legions and died within months. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of anarchy in which Rome nearly destroyed itself. Armies, made and unmade rulers. Provinces broke away to form their own empires. And invasions from Goths, Persians, and countless others pressed every border. Plague swept through the cities. Coins were debased until silver shrank to a ghost of itself, its content falling from 95% to 5%. Inflation devoured savings, trade faltered, faith in the old gods dissolved. And yet, amid the ruin, the machinery of empire kept turning. Roads still carried messengers, courts still issued decrees, taxes still found their way to the capital. The idea of Rome proved harder to kill than its rulers. Stability returned, briefly, under Diocletian, a peasant-turned-emperor whose genius was organization, not charisma. He understood that no single man could command so vast a world. To survive, Rome would have to divide. In 293, he created the Tetrarchy, a rule of 4, 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 juniors, the Caesars. The system worked by mathematics, not affection. Each governed a quarter of the empire, sharing authority while pretending to unity. It was bureaucracy elevated to theology. Diocletian also sought to control the economy's collapse. He issued the edict on maximum prices, fixing the cost of everything from grain to labor. But markets defy decrees. Traders vanished, goods disappeared, and black markets flourished. Inflation remained immortal. Still, he reformed the army, strengthened borders, and enforced a persecution of Christians so harsh that it produced martyrs faster than it produced results. Eventually, exhausted by his own order, Diocletian did what no emperor before him had dared. He abdicated. Retiring to his palace in Dalmatia, he spent his final years tending gardens, while the empire he had divided began to reunite under stronger wills. Among those wills was one that would redefine the world: Constantine. Rising through war and intrigue, he emerged from civil conflict as sole ruler in 324. His victory at the Milvian Bridge, under a vision of the cross and the motto, "In this sign, conquer," forever changed the empire's soul. Christianity, once persecuted, became favored. Pagan temples yielded to churches. The old gods faded like statues left in the rain. Constantine understood geography as destiny. Rome, heavy with memory, was no longer fit to rule an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts of Syria. In 330, he founded a new capital on the Bosporus, Constantinople, the city of Constantine, a crossroads between Europe and Asia, trade and faith. Marble palaces rose where Greek fishermen had once hauled nets, and from that glittering harbour, a new Rome looked east. The centuries that followed were an age of division disguised as endurance. The empire split permanently into 2 halves. The eastern, centered on Constantinople, rich and resilient, and the western, governed from Ravenna, impoverished and exposed. The east had gold and grain. The west had memory and pride. Over time, pride proved the weaker defense. In the west, waves of barbarian migrations, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, crashed against the frontiers. Some came as invaders, others as refugees seeking land within the empire's borders. Rome, desperate for soldiers, allowed them to settle as federati, allies bound by treaty but loyal only to survival. The legions, once Roman to the bone, now spoke a dozen tongues. In 410, the unimaginable happened. The Visigoth king Alaric marched into Italy and sacked Rome itself. For 3 days, fire and looting consumed the Eternal City. The world that had ruled nations for 1,000 years lay open to plunder. Yet even then, the empire did not die. It merely shrank, as if trying to preserve its heart by sacrificing its limbs. Half a century later, even that heart gave out. In 476, a Germanic commander named Odoacer, serving as Roman general, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. No battle marked the end, no monument the fall, just the quiet paperwork of conquest. The Senate sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging that one emperor was enough. The Western Empire had dissolved into kingdoms that spoke Latin, but dreamed in other tongues. In the East, Byzantium endured for another 1,000 years, preserving law, learning, and the faith that had transformed the old gods into saints. In the West, the memory of Rome became inheritance, its roads the skeleton of nations, its laws the grammar of justice, its language the root of prayer. Even in ruin, it refused to vanish. No single date could contain the fall. The empire had not collapsed in a day. It had slowly changed its name. What had begun on the banks of the Tiber as a cluster of huts ended as an idea larger than any city, any army, or any emperor. In marble and dust alike, Rome had achieved what no power before or since has matched. It had turned time itself into a province.